When I was recording the video for this quilt, originally I intended it all to be one video, but it wasn't until I started processing and editing the video that I realized it was way too long. The first portion of this video, which was doing the dahlia portion of the quilting, that ended up being almost an hour long. So I'm splitting this video in half, and when we come back we'll be doing the Alouette pattern in the background of the quilt. So for this reason I didn't originally make a introductory portion for part 2, but this will serve as that. So in this video we will conclude the machine quilting in the background, which is a digital pattern, and we will do the clipping blocks and Nozo zone for those portions, and that pretty much will wrap up this quilt. And this may be one of the only times it's viewed on here, so I just thought I would go ahead and do this introduction, and then we can get on to the next part of the video. Welcome back to the studio. I know it's the same day for you, but it's a different day for me. I would say good morning, but I've made it till noontime already. Before I started today, I went back over the quilt and I finished up any ruler work that I needed to do to stabilize the center applique portion of this quilt, or any free motion work that needed to be tied up, because literally when I finish with this panto, hopefully today, I want to get this quilt off of the frame. It's been on here for a couple of weeks, and this quilt was going along really well for several phases of the quilt. It wasn't until I got to applying the inner border and 2 inner borders, the pieced border and the outer border, that things started to fall apart on me. You will notice as you look at the quilt that there are no inner borders, pieced border or outer border, because they all had to be removed and scrapped. So that was just the beginning of some of the problems. Also, some of the places where the silk was pieced began shredding when I got it onto the machine, so I've had to do a lot of overstitching in some of those areas. So it's not my greatest success, but we're going to proceed anyway because there's still some great learning opportunities involved with this project. Yesterday I worked on using Dahlia digital design that Urban Elements created, and they did create it because I asked. It went specifically for this project, but it is available on the website. I believe the pronunciation is Caballero. I will have the link for that in the video. Today what I'm going to be doing is using a panto on the large blue background for the quilt, and that's going to require several Nozo zones. And I'm going to go ahead and program the panto for the whole quilt, and I hope I remember. I'm going to, after I program the panto in as a quilt, I'm going to save that as a project in case I get into any area where I make a mistake in my Nozo zone and I inadvertently go a step back too far and I delete the whole pattern. I don't want to have to try and reimagine the whole digital design from scratch. So I'm going to try and remember to save the panto portion of it as a quilt so I can pull it back up as needed, and it would be exactly the same position and size. Also, I will say this is just one way of doing this type of thing. There are a lot of ways to accomplish this on the IntelliQuilter, where you would have a panto or design in the background, and you don't want to sew over a medallion or embroidery or an applique. So this is just one of them. It's probably hopefully one of the easier ones, and we'll be able to get that done today. But there's also a lot of other ways to do it, and hopefully as I progress in learning I can show some of those to you. But I think this one is easy enough to follow along, and I think I've studied it enough to be able to do it myself. So let's get moving over to the machine. We'll get the design loaded, and then we will go ahead and start stitching and see how it goes. Whenever you turn on the handy quilter, it's always going to ask you to bring it all the way forward to the front rail and also to the center. That's just a way of it knowing where it is on the frame, and that you have to do because the machine will beep and drive you crazy until you do it and click OK. So before I get started on the design, I'm going to move the quilt back into the upper left-hand corner because sometimes I forget to do that. When I'm moving the head of the machine over to that corner, it's registering still where it is on the frame. So when I program the quilt, it knows it's already up in that corner and it's able to stitch out accordingly. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've done all of my ruler work on the quilt, so I don't need the ruler base anymore, and I'm going to take that off because it gives me a few more inches in the front and the sides without hitting any obstruction notice. So I'm taking that off, and I'm going to go ahead and move the head of the machine to the upper left hand corner. Okay, we're going to start the way we normally start to load a Panto. We're going to hit Design Sew Quilt, starting anew. I already have a work in progress. Do I want to replace it? It was me practicing, so yes. Do I want to erase it permanently? Yes. And do I want to restart my clock? Yes. Now I get to choose if I'm going to do a black Panto, a block pattern, or a line pattern. And this is a traditional pantograph. And I'm going to enter the rectangle manually because I can't move the head of the machine long enough to get to the bottom while it's rolled up. I'm just going to input its measurements. So we're going to do 80 inches wide and 82 inches long. And we're going to continue and finish. Now I get to choose the Pantograph pattern. This particular dahlia didn't actually come with a Panto to go for the back, but I found something very similar called Alouette. So I'm just going to go to Alouette in the Urban Elementz program, and I have changed many of the names. So this says Alouette 9. It's to me just an indication of how high the pattern was originally. So I'm going to choose Alouette for both the even and odd rows. And here you see it come up on the screen as a Panto. I don't like this big gap in the middle, so I can just go ahead and touch gap and then drag until it interlocks the way I would want it to. And right about there I'm happy. But it's showing my row height at 12 inches and the pattern height at 18 inches, which is too big for what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and hit row height, and I'm just going to manually put in 8 inches. I've already kind of practiced trying to load this design, and this is what I was most happy with. So we've got this all set up, and I'm going to hit finished. And I'm going to accept this transition type. And now my quilt Panto is set up to do the whole quilt if there were no no-sew zones. At this point I have the option of save quilt pattern, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to save and rename the quilt, and I'm going to name it what the actual quilt is called. Which is Christ Panto Creator. Now I have to save that somewhere, and I'm going to save it in work in progress backup. And there it is. So this is how it would be if I didn't have to worry about any no-sew zone. But I need to add a no-sew zone, so I'm going to add edit block, add block, and then a no-sew zone. I'm going to do these row by row, and I'm only going to work on like a segment at a time. So sometimes it may be one panto row and sometimes it may be two, but I'm going to touch the rows that are affected. I think that's as far as I can go with this on this particular section. So I'm going to mark on quilt, and I've got my projection clicker, and I'm going to go ahead and start moving the quilt to its first position. And as long as I see the lines in red, I know that I'm working with rows that I'm actually going to affect. So the first thing I have to do is the sun, and I'm going to remove the camera because I know you can't see anything yet. So I'm going to use the clicker, and I'm going to do an outline of the sun first, as much as I can do in this first pass, and then I'm just going to close the block. So I'm just going to carefully make as many marks as I need to go around the sun. I won't be able to do the whole sun because the bar is in the way. I'm doing as far as I can do with this particular position of the quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit close block, and that closed off that shape. I hit finished, and that eliminated all of the pantoed quilting where the sun is as far as I can go. So I'm going to hit finished, accept, and now I'm going to go on to the next segment and hit add block, Nozo zone, and I'm going to do the same thing here around this top arc of the applique. So I've got my needle in position, and sometimes it helps if you lower the needle so you can get a fairly accurate representation of where the stitching will end. I've selected the blocks again that are affected, the rows, and I'm going to mark on quilt. And I can make as many little registration marks as I want along the edge to make sure we get as close to the applique as possible. Now I've come down to the other side. I'm just going to hit closed block, and that's going to create a solid shape that it could eliminate. I hit finished, and as you can see, we now have a large portion there that it's not going to stitch over. So that's part two. One thing I will say, when we get to some of these elements, it's going to do some backtracking right there in between these shapes. And so you want to try and be as careful as you can. But as I said, this is just one way to do this process, but it's how I'm going to do it today. I'm using a very low contrast thread. It will be the same blue as the background. And so it's a learning process. I'm going to go ahead with it. And I'm going to go ahead now and do the same process for the moon on the right hand side, and then we can get this started for stitching out. I've just hit sew quilt, so the machine is moving into position to do its first stitch. The very first row is going to be a very small partial row at the top, so it's not even going to take very long to do those pieces, and it's going all the way to the very corner because we have a very tiny stitch there to start off. It's just asked me to set the machine to a constant speed, which is manual on my machine, and it's already done one stitch to help pull up the thread. I want to make sure I don't get those tangled, and I can hit start. It's just going to be stitching out some of the very small elements of the very first partial row. It's not even a whole complete row. And we will watch as it stitches across. And it really won't be until our next row that we really see where some of the Nozo zones have been incorporated. As beautiful as this quilt is, or at least as beautiful as I wanted it to be, it's ending up to be a pretty good practice piece. It's going to have a lot of mistakes in it. In the upper right hand corner, the first half row sewed out really nice. The second row, because it wasn't panto sequenced in a whole quilt, I had to realign the edge, and it didn't realign properly. So I had to stop it and overstitch it, rather than spending a week trying to rip it out. And it's silk, so ripping it out would have been hard on the front. When I take the quilt off the frame, I can always rip that partial sewing from the back, which will make it a little bit easier to protect the silk in the front. Because it's not panto sequence, it doesn't automatically start each row again, so I have to realign each row and restart, which I've done for the first full row, and now I'm doing it for the second full row. It's meeting up to my sun, and it's not overlapping the sun. It's actually very accurate there. So I know that the accuracy of the Nozo zone is going well, but this upper portion here has got some overstitching on it where one design overlaps the other. And I'll see how bad that looks when I get to it. So far though, it's meeting the applique very well, and we'll see what happens when we get to this right edge of the upper halo. It should stop and let me restart on the other side. This will give you a better close-up view of what is going to happen when the machine hits the Nozo zone. You can see we overstitched here a little bit, so my measurements weren't exact enough. Now those I will remove. This is what is happening on the right side of the Nozo zone. I restarted here, and it's going to go ahead and continue sewing out this portion. It looks like I have a little space up here. I'm going to have to go back and restart, only because I didn't see where the actual start point was. So I'll restart and do this little element, and then stop it when it gets back down to where it's already quilted. You can see how close we are to our applique. After this, I'm going to have to go back and reset new Nozo zones for the quilt. Okay, I've programmed in the bottom part of the sun and the moon, and I've eliminated the central applique. Now that I've been able to actually do the steps on the quilt, on the next run I will try and do a better job of illustrating what it is that I'm doing. I've got this lined up. I'm going to go ahead and hit start. This is basically the third full row. So I'm hoping we get up in here and we're lined up properly. It's filling the space, so I feel like we do have the alignment where it needs to be. I've got 3 Nozo zones on this portion of the panto: the sun, the moon, and the central applique. So I'm going to go ahead and let this stitch out and see what it looks like when we get to the edge. This is the first time I've ever used a Nozo zone of this size, so it is a learning process. Of course, it's additional steps at each step of the way, but if you did want to do a project like this and have a beautiful panto in the background of your applique, this is the capability of doing it. But I'm ready to stop the machine at any point, because the last time it started just stitching a straight line, so I may not have chosen the right selection for the jump transition. So if it starts stitching over the applique at any point, I'm going to stop the machine and restart it on the other side. But you can see it has split the design there. I moved the needle over to the new start position and just hit restart, and we have it started up. It's still continuing around my Nozo zone on the center. It should also include the moon here in just a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to see if I can capture this intelligently. This is what the screen looks like now. I've already sewn a partial row and 3 full rows, and you can see my no-sew zone for part of it. I didn't select this curly part here that goes into the body because it wasn't a row I was sewing yet. So my screen is touch a pattern to see its properties, but I'm going to try hitting sew quilt, and it's giving me the option of choosing my next pattern. That's going to be this row, so I'm going to continue. I'm going to go back, sew quilt, select the next pattern, swap start and end points, so it starts over here at 2. Now I'm going to hit continue, and because I'm already over here and in position, I can, well, I'm just going to hit stop and cut threads and then hit sew quilt. Now that I have this row highlighted in order to quilt, I have my start for that design here. But if I go along the design over to the lowest point, I can't go any lower on the frame because I've hit my end. So I know that I'm going to have to roll the quilt up, but I have the pattern that I want to sew highlighted. So I'm going to go ahead and realign the quilt after I get it rolled up. So I'm going to roll next. I couldn't find my pen. I'd put it back where it belongs. So I've rolled the quilt up and now I have to realign. So again, I'm going to choose that big curve, the lowest bottom curve of the design that I've already sewn. So I've touched that. I'm going to move the needle position to there and hit continue, and okay. I'm going to hit restart. And come back to the start position of the next row. So I have to go back. This is the one I've already sewn, so I need to select the next piece to quilt is this one. And my start is over here, so I'll hit continue. My start is over here. That's my start for 3. Now I'm going to go back and add my clipping block this time. Add block, clipping block. This time I'm going to outline the area that I want to sew and eliminate the rest. The problem that this might bring up is that it will erase the whole row, in which case I'll just bring back in the quilt that I saved earlier, which would be the exact same format, and do the clipping block on that side, and we will go from there. I'm going to make sure I'm in the right spot. So it's this row that I want to clip, and I'm going to just go ahead and incorporate the whole area that I want that clipping block to keep. Got my clicker, and I'm just going to go ahead and outline by marking on the quilt. I'm going to outline the whole area I want to keep. And I can just go over I'm doing the same thing I would for the no-sew zone, only I'm selecting what I want to keep rather than what I want to get rid of. Now I've designated an area of my clipping block that I want to keep. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. I had to get rid of a little jig jag. So I've got the whole block finished. Now you can see what it's going to keep. I'm only doing the red portion of the design, so I'll do that, go to the other side and bring in the quilt again, and we'll see if we can't get a better effect for the background panto this way than we had on the no-sew zone. So quilt, I'm going to sew that and continue. As I said, I'm learning this myself. In the future, you'll see better variations on how to do this. Now when it gets to the end, it's going to stop. Well, it's going to stop now because it detected a thread break. And we had a thread break because we are out of bobbin thread. So we'll go ahead and put a new bobbin in and get back to the start position. I'll finish this little bit of sewing. But when it gets to the end, because that was a clipping block, it will stop directly where the end of the pattern was. So I may have to reintroduce the pattern at the other end, but I think I like this better than the results I was getting with the Nozo zone until I learned better. You can see the program clipped this whole portion of the design. This part I didn't need, but this part I did. So remember earlier I saved this whole panto. When I bring it up, it'll bring it up exactly the same size and shape and placement as it is now. I'm just going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've done 5 rows. What I need is the 6th row. So I'm going to just go ahead and back out of this. I'm back to the beginning. Design sew quilt. Edit an existing quilt. Work in progress is this one. Here's my original. I'm going to go ahead and click on that and open it. Do I want to replace the one I had in progress? Yes. Resetting the time. Okay, so here we are back with my original panto. I'm going to go over to the right hand side. I'm going to go down to row 6. I'm going to align to the edge of the pattern I already have, and then I'm going to go ahead and restart. First, I'm going to go ahead and clip my threads. Now, I fully admit this may be a back alley way of doing this, but it's where I am right now in the learning curve, and it is getting the job done, so I'm going to continue on. I need to touch a reference point. Remember, it was row 6 that we needed to do, so I'm going to choose the largest curve at the bottom of a design of row 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm letting the machine know exactly where I am. I'm going to hit continue because I've touched that point. Now I'm going to hit sew quilt. And I need to do row 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the row I need to sew next. Again, I'm going to hit continue. Well, I'm going to hit swap and endpoints. So it starts on this right hand side and moves to the center. I've done that. I'm going to hit sew quilt. I'm going to go back and add pattern. Add pattern. Nope. Add block. Add block. Clipping block. So again, I'm going to outline the area that I actually want it to sew out. And this is the pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I want affected by this. So I'm going to just do anywhere that pattern would sew. I'm going to mark on the quilt using my clicker. I'm going to hit close block. Now I have an enclosed unit of what I want it to sew. I'm going to hit finished. You can see it's highlighted there. It's eliminated from the halo to the other side. I've already done the other side, so I can hit finished and accept. And finished. And now I can hit sew quilt. I want it to sew this pattern. So I'm going to hit continue. I'm going to pull up my thread. This may be a backwards way of getting this design only in the background, It may be extra steps from a better way, but I'm happy to get the job done. And it's lining up with the other pattern fine. So I'm going to continue to do this with the clipping blocks until I get down below where the pattern would actually connect again. Then I can go back to the Nozo zone. I would like to point out at this point, as it occurs to me, that I'm doing this on a digital computer as a Nozo zone or as a clipping block. However, if I was using a paper pantograph from the back, all I would have to do is mark these points on my pantograph grids and mark on there with a red dry erase marker that that's my stop point. And I could sew over to the edge of the design and any edits that I made on the pantograph grid, and then just pop over to the other side and start again where my edits were on the pantograph grids. So this actually would seem to go probably faster by doing this manually from the rear, utilizing the pantograph grids to make edits or marks on the quilt, on the pantograph grids from the quilt, to know where your stop and start points are. So this could be done either from the front or the back of the machine, from the back with the pantograph grids and a paper panto, digitally from the front using the program. As I go back and forth, I'm going to go between the version of this that I saved that I was working on, because it will always have the right sides still there, and then I will jump back to this version of this program and do the right sides, because it will always be there. So I will have two versions of this in the tablet that I'm working on to continue giving me these two sides, rather than having to reload the whole quilt every time. It won't save that much time, but it is a one way to save a step. So I'm going to go ahead, roll the quilt back up again, and do the other two sides until we can get below this bottom curve. Okay, I've done the clipping blocks and done all of the side pieces where it really is two patterns. I realize now that a no-sew zone is always going to sew and echo around the area that it's not going to sew, because it's a continuous line drawing that it's going to do. So because it was split into two, it was just going to sew right across the middle of my design. This is why a clipping block worked better for me now. I could have also done the no-sew zone and then split the pattern, but I don't know how to do that yet. So the clipping block worked good for me. I do have a couple areas where I'm going to have to take out a little bit of the sewing, but now I'm at the bottom of the block where it should be one continuous row of panto. I created a no-sew zone, and it will be able to sew that continuous line along the bottom. There's nothing on the top. So I'm going to go ahead and select start and see how far we get on this bottom piece. When we get down to the very bottom here, it should either just go around the bottom or a very small piece of the design. After I get it rolled up one more time, I'll go ahead and fasten down this flap so it doesn't get caught up in the sewing. But this is all going to get cut off anyway. In the end, I'll show you what the finished quilt looks like. It may not look too bad on camera. You won't be able to see all the mistakes that you would see up close, so it's not going to be a show-stopping quilt by any means, but it still should have a graphic appeal. And we have been able to use it to illustrate the no-sew zone, the clipping block, and placing the dahlia designs exactly in the segments that they belong to. I can absolutely assure you that I'm going to be really glad to get this off the frame, because it has had a lot of issues. I have a thread break. It might be out of bobbin, so I'll go ahead and change that. We're back after that thread break. I really like this Alouette pattern. I think it looks good with the Dahlia pattern that was called Caballero or Calabrio. I think Caballero. Seems like I get better accuracy with the clipping block. Every time I do the no-sew zone, it seems to sew over top of my applique. So I'm going to have to come back and cut those stitches out. Okay, I've got the quilt off of the frame, and I think we have some learning lessons in the video for this week. I am really glad to have this off. For you and I, it's only been yesterday and today, but I have been working on this particular project for months, and it was meant to be in a show. The show has already started, and this is still here. It's had multiple failures. As I mentioned earlier, all the borders had to be cut off. The silk was just shredding in places, and that was just the beginning of the problems. Anywhere that the silk was machine pieced or foundation pieced, there was also some additional fraying when I got it on the frame. And my bright idea to pleat the robe ended up to be problematic also because it made it harder to go through the rollers. There were a lot more problems. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. But anyway, we have the Dahlia pieced pattern in the back. That was okay, that none of that was shredding. And we have the quilting pattern called Caballero in the different wedges of the background. That came out good. And we have enlarged some of those Dahlia patterns back in the background of the white. That's just to show you that even though this came from a Dahlia pattern, I was able to use some of the block components in other ways. So I was able to position that using a clipping block and increasing the size of the pattern. Placed all of these in the block as a block unit, and then we used the panto in the background. I believe that was Allegro. Was able to quilt the panto in the background behind all of the pieces. There's going to be, after I look at this area, there's some overstitching. Because this is never going to be exhibited, I may leave the overstitching on there. If I do have to rip it out, I'm going to rip it out from the back where I have a better chance of not shredding the fabric. And you can see I picked up all kinds of silk lint because there's lint all over my studio upstairs. At any rate, this is a finished project. I have to still put the border on it, not the border, the binding and a sleeve. I will probably be the only one that gets to enjoy this. It will probably get hung somewhere in the house. Won't be exhibited too much outside of the house. I know on video it probably doesn't look too bad, but up close it's got some warts. So I have a little bit of ripping to do. But at any rate, I want to thank you for stopping by the studio, watching me use these beautiful Urban Elements pantos both on the Dahlia and the background. And hopefully the next time you pop in, I won't be like the crazy rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. Maybe things will be a little settled down. I am looking forward to a new year, that's for sure. So thanks for stopping by. We'll see you again next time, and
I'm signing out.